Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian up here at the Rayburn House office building in Washington, D.C., where we're covering the Amphibious Warfare Industrial Base Coalition, gathering of all the companies that contribute to the manufacture of amphibious warships for the United States Navy. We heard from Commandant Neller, but we also heard from the chairman of the Seapower and Projection Forces Committee, Rob Wittman from America's First, a Republican from the 1st District of Virginia. Sir, thanks very much for the time.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. What a great day.
It is a great day, a lot of great speakers. Want to start off by asking you your view of the Trump administration's new budget. You've made it clear shipbuilding is a priority for you. Last year you sponsored legislation that said 355 ships is the floor, not the ceiling, for the United States Navy. Tell us what you think about the president's submission.
Well, looking at the president's budget compared to the National Defense Authorization Act and the appropriation that came out of the House, and what will be reflected in the appropriation bill to be coming up in the next several weeks, there's a disparity there. I believe that for shipbuilding, the floor going forward needs to be what's in this year's National Defense Authorization Act and the appropriation, which is $26.2 billion and 13 ships. The president's budget is at $21 billion and 10 ships. So I'm adamant to say we cannot go any lower than 13 ships for a variety of reasons, to make sure we get to 355 ships, to make sure we maintain industrial base capacity, and make sure we maintain serial production, which is the way to bring costs down. In these days, I think it's more important than ever to be able to manage costs. Doing that through serial production and predictability is what we have to do.
But how do you get there from here, right? As you mentioned and other members mentioned, there is a competition for resources. It's good times, but there are also jitters and concerns about the future. Talk to us about how you bridge this gap.
Well, absolutely. There are additional dollars that have been agreed to for next year's budget, so we have some of that. Now, the president's budget allocates that. Congress's job is to look at that allocation and determine, is it correct? I would argue that it is not correct in relation to shipbuilding, so we will have to compete for those dollars. I think we have a very compelling case to make about building our Navy to where it needs to be, what it does to project power, what it does to counter those major near-peer adversaries out there, which are reflected in the National Defense Strategy. So I think it aligns there. It's our job to make the argument to make sure that we place priorities with ships and shipbuilding.
One of the passionate speakers today was Walt Jones, somebody who's got a Republican from North Carolina, represents the Camp Lejeune area, passionately spoke about debt. And we've heard the same thing coming from Adam Smith, the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, who looks at this as a 2-year window before everything catches up to us and we got to start cutting. Do you think this is the right budget plan given is the Navy Marine Corps team and the administration focusing its resources on the right places, given that its funding window may only be 2 years?
Well, I do, and obviously we have to look long range and where those revenues in the entire budget come from. One of the things we're going to have to talk about, and you can't do it in a political realm, although it's difficult, is talk about the mandatory spending side of things. In a $4.4 trillion budget, when $1.3 trillion is discretionary spending and the remainder is mandatory spending, the only way that you really get your arms around the magnitude of what we're facing is you have to have an adult conversation about mandatory spending. We have to rebuild this nation's military capacity. I think the National Defense Strategy lays it out. Here are these near-peer adversaries. They're continuing at breakneck speed to develop capability. If we lapse there, I argue the world's a less safe place. If you look at major conflicts throughout the history of mankind, they have always occurred where there's an imbalance between major powers. If we allow that imbalance to take place, where either Russia or China, or even for that matter, an opportunist like Iran or North Korea sees it, then we place ourselves in greater danger of a conflict. A strong United States, I think, assures that there will not be conflict because other powers are going to say, no, let's not do that because it'll be really bad. If they think they can gain an advantage and quickly come in and defeat us, that puts us at, I think, a much higher level of risk.
You're a bipartisan member. You think bipartisanly. In our conversations, you've talked about trying to figure out ways of solving some of these big problems. Do you think, but the atmosphere up here is very, very toxic right now. Is there room for bipartisan voices to come together to start to tackle some of these big challenges, especially on the non-discretionary side of things?
I think there has to be. I think the nation expects that. I think the magnitude of what we face is so significant that we're going to have to get together and find solutions to these problems. I mean, the trustees of the mandatory spending programs, the largest ones, Social Security and Medicare, tell us what's happening. It's around the corner. 2029 is where we start to see the reduction in benefits that go to those individuals. So we have to do it. It's a compelling reason that the public gives to us and that other policymakers give to us to say, get things done. I think we can do it. I think it's more challenging today with a lot of political noise back and forth, but we all have to be willing to have the conversation with the public to say, here's what we have to do, here's why we have to do it, here's the way we're going to do it that's reasonable and thoughtful for everybody, and I think conditions dictate that we get it done.
Let me ask you, what are your expectations of the 30-year shipbuilding plan? It's legislatively required by the Navy on an annual basis. What are your expectations? What do you hope to see when Secretary Spencer gets that finished and submits it to you guys?
Well, what I want to see is the 355 ships reflected there. Now, it's not. It's at 342 ships with caveats to say, well, if Congress provides some more funding, we can get to 355. You know, that was not the direction from Congress. Direction from Congress was 355. Then what we have to do is to say, how do we get there? I think any ambivalence towards 355 becomes problematic, because then it's a situation to say, well, if the Navy really doesn't believe that they need those ships, then why would Congress supersede what the Navy has said? Now, the Navy will argue, as I've talked to them, that the nuanced perspective is 355 ships. I don't think there should be any nuance in the 30-year shipbuilding plan. I think it should be direct, forthright, and unambiguous. 355 ships, that's what we're going to have to work on.
Let me ask you about block buys. We heard that said this morning. Block buy for amphibious ships in particular. Everybody's trying to get from 31 to 38 for the level of those ships. Tell us, do you think that's a good idea to do a block buy approach, given that Congress has always been reticent to do that kind of a thing, especially for shipbuilding?
Well, I do. I think it's critical, because we know serial production brings down costs. We know certainty there for the industrial base is what they need to make the investments to increase efficiency. All those things are things we need to do. All of us have looked at how do we reduce the cost per ship. If you build them one at a time, costs we know historically go up because there's lack of predictability and certainty for the supplier base and the manufacturers, and they're going to reflect that in the risk that they take in building one ship at a time. So we know with certainty comes reduced cost and greater efficiencies. You know, you can maintain a workforce for longer periods of time. We know the workforce is going to stay because they say, hey, we've got work for the next 10 years. Those are things I think are critical. They're critical for the nation and the industrial base we must maintain. They're critical as we face increased fiscal challenges in doing more with the same number of dollars. I think serial production, block buys are the way for us to be able to do that. And we've seen historically when we started major programs and we've said, well, the cost per unit has gone up too much, and we say, well, the way we respond to that is to reduce production. What's happened? Costs continue to go up because it costs more to produce a smaller number. So we have to reflect that in making sure we pursue block buys and serial production in ships.
We've been talking about new construction, but you and I were talking before we had a chance to start the formal interview, and you expressed a little bit of concern whether or not all of the ships in the amphibious force are going to be upgraded to be able to operate the F-35 aircraft. There's new deck cladding. We were aboard the USS America, and we saw that new cladding on the deck. Essex as well as Wasp are being modified with that. But you expressed the concern that some of the F-35s the Marine Corps has may be operating off of shore. Talk to us a little bit about how much money you think that's going to take. And the Commandant of the Marine Corps added another element to it. He said, we've got a fifth-generation aircraft with fifth-generation data collection and command and control capabilities with ships that don't have that capability on them. Talk to us about how much money is going to be put aside to modify these ships to get most value out of this leap-ahead asset they're buying.
Well, I think the key is this, as we look in the future, is to make sure we coordinate the availability of these new aircraft and the capability on the ships. The Commandant's got it right. They're fifth-generation platform with a lot of ability to take in information. If we don't have a ship that can use it, process it, and transmit it, those are issues. Also making sure that the upgrade schedule for the ships to be able to accommodate the additional loads and heat from this jet coincide with the availability of that aircraft. So if you have squadrons coming into availability, but ships that aren't designed to be able to launch and retrieve those aircraft, we've got an issue. So you have to make sure time frames are there. I was just on board the USS Kearsarge, and talking to them about where they are in the line. They're an older model ship, so they're a little bit further down the line as far as upgrades. I think all those things we have to think about. We have to get the full life out of these ships. We can't afford to be building new ones prior to the expected life of these ships. But there is a cost element of upgrading these ships and a coordination aspect of making sure that we don't have ships sitting around waiting for aircraft or not being able to field these newer aircraft and not be able to use the full scope of data that comes on board. So two of those things have to be addressed. There is a price tag associated with it. The good news is it's much, much, much less than a new ship. So we have to do it. The matter is, how do we do it the right time frames, and how do we make sure that we don't get ahead of ourselves? If we have more aircraft than we have ships available, these aircraft aren't designed to sit on shore. They're designed to go to sea.
Let me ask you this. One of the questions the Marine Corps privately for a long time has been asking is whether it should actually have bigger ships than it does. The size of the big deck aircraft carrier is constrained by the dry docks and other facilities we have, whereas it can be easily said that the amphibious assault ship footprint is governed in part because we don't want a ship that gets too close to looking like an aircraft carrier ultimately. But everything the Marine Corps is using, whether it's the F-35, whether it's the V-22, whether it's their personal or even their mechanized equipment, is too large. Is it time to relook at the footprint of the Marine Corps' amphibious assault ships, and if we need something that's bigger, if we need something that needs a ski ramp on it, for example, which we discussed, which is a British innovation on those ships to get greater efficacy from them, is it time to embrace some bigger muscle movements as opposed to just building the same thing that we're building?
Well, there's several moving pieces going on right now. As you know, they are looking at a small aircraft carrier. Now, a large deck amphib is not a small aircraft carrier. It's designed to carry Marines, to launch Marines. So with the well deck, it's designed for a large number of rotor-winged aircraft, a smaller number of fixed-wing aircraft. So with its mission set, the way it's designed today, probably sufficient for that. But as General Neller spoke about, you can't look at building a ship today without looking at what you're going to need tomorrow. And that's what I think does beg the question is, what's the capability of the Marine Corps going to be going forward? V-22s, F-35 Bravos, additional capability there. Well, how are we going to get there? It does, I think, ask this question of all of us. What's the future design going to be? And where do we look at the transition to say, now we have a new ship that meets those different challenges we have in the future? Those questions need to be asked now so that it can be reflected in the decisions of the future in both the design and the purchase and operation of those ships.
Rob Wittman, Chairman of the Seapower and Projected Forces Committee from Virginia's 1st District, America's 1st, sir. Thanks very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks again.